Okay, so maybe we'll start. And who knows, maybe they won't even come. It's Monday. And they had just come back from DC yesterday. So we'll see. Okay, so let's talk about e-governance today. Again, let me point you to the framework, right? We've moved past the conceptual part. And then, as you can see, over the last, 4 weeks or so, 5 weeks, we have covered a broad overview of all the sectors. Well, I wouldn't even say all. I think that there are as many ICT 4D subsectors as there are international development sectors. So just take this as a broad sort of introduction. And honestly, each of these things could be an entire class in itself. So on the subject of e-governance, let's move into the readings, and hopefully that you took a look at that. And I wanted to ask, tell me a little bit about what is e-governance? What's e-governance?
So either providing government information to people through an e-platform, or even letting them interact, submit applications online.
Awesome. So information, right? Some kind of interaction. Anything else?
But even internally, right, for the government.
Say that again?
Even internally for the government.
Internal,
yeah. Processes.
Internal processes. Good job. Yeah. It's sort of the things that we in the first world have sort of slowly taken for granted, right? I mean, you want to see, well, how do I renew my driver's license? You go online, it tells you, here's the place to go, you click a link, and then it gives you an address. In developing countries, you don't get this kind of information. You get it at the most, you ask your neighbor, how do I renew my driver's license, if there's even such a thing. Most of the time it's like, how do I get an ID? And then there's no information at all, and they'll point you into 17 different directions. And so at the end of the day, people give up on being part of the governance system. And so it's sort of a loose framework for everyone. So if I would point you, and e-governance, like I said, is a huge field. It's not only a course these days, you can actually get a master's in e-governance. So it shows you how broad, each of these things that we're covering are. But once upon a time, and this is still sort of the framework, and we've covered a lot of it, the Heeks, who is sort of the godfather of e-governance at ICTD, he said, what are the phases of any kind of e-government, right? With any government. And if you look at all these things that you've talked about, he says, the governments go through a certain, you feeling okay?
Yeah.
They go through phases as to how e-government is implemented. And you can think of this in terms of your own countries and also your own experiences with government. This is not in the meetings, this is in a framework. And the issue about me teaching this course is that this is sort of my field, so I might overlook with information. So just stop me. So what they say is that, first and foremost, governments usually start with internal processes. Right, so you wire up, you make sure that you're networked, you have email, you can actually talk to other governments who might have some kind of a document management system internally. Then, as you scale up, you kind of come into some kind of an information, or what they call, information. And these in itself has a lot of sub graphs, right? And you think about what are the things you can implement. Same with information, right? You have a web presence, and then you website, and then you have names of the ministers, even emails, and emails pointing to the minister. So this is kind of like a storefront at the second phase, and then the third phase, what you do. Is, so this is the second, right? And the type of interaction, what he calls, he calls this transactional, but it's kind of, so this is phase 1, 2, 3, right? And then the third phase is transactional, which is some kind of interaction. So this is something like, well, you know, in this Bangladeshi case, it's downloading of forms, right? And of course, this is again a spectrum because it could just be download forms, but that's it. That's the end of the line. But you can also have it more sophisticated to say, well, download forms, fill out forms, you know, submit forms, etc., you know, give feedback and all that. And then, you know, he says, well, you know, at some point, governments might actually become e-governance might have a transformative kind of role, you know, and this he's talking about things like, you know, feedback from citizens, you know, what Obama is doing, being transparent, and maybe even looking at coming to things like the Egypt side of things, when things become so scaled up that, you know, it flattens the power play. So that's the sort of phases of e-governance that is sort of thought about in this day and time. So question would be, in the readings, tell me a bit about what is the framework that they're using to evaluate that Bangladeshi e-government project.
The measures of impact?
Huh?
Are you talking about the measures of impact?
Yeah, so basically, okay, so you're talking about, it's a very simple framework they use, right? So they use a method with a framework, right? And then they apply it to the Bangladeshi, the country. Well, actually what they did was they basically just applied it to a website, right? And then they generalize this for Bangladesh. Right? So what is so the methodology itself could be criticized on multiple levels, right? If you're an academic, you say, well, you know, the method is too simple. The methodology, you're asking, you know, just government officials. You know, as you go about doing your own questionnaires or projects in future too, you would question things like this. You know, is how objective would it be if you were just interviewing government officials, and would they ever say, yes, the politics is preventing me from implementing this project because you know, my boss is, you know, whatever. But that's not going to happen. So you can criticize this on multiple levels, but let's not do that, but instead focus on the methods. And so, you know, Priya, you were saying, like, they basically use the Higgs method, right, of saying, well, these are factors. And so what are those things that they say, let's use these indicators to measure?
Well, there's awareness of that initiative.
Yeah, well, they talk about awareness. So I think, you know, like in this...
And the use.
Huh?
And the use as well.
Right, and the perception. So they talk about awareness, right? And also perception of benefits. Right, as part of the measure, and honestly, I don't really know how this comes in. I'm guessing it's just like, okay, you know, let's just see what the landscape is. But then what I hear them saying is, okay, we're going to use the framework and we're going to use the Higgs model, right, of looking at these 7 or 8 indicators that are usually success or failure factors. What are some of those things? Krista?
Internal political desire.
Awesome. Okay, internal political desire, or, you know, sometimes we call it political will, right? I mean, you know, those of us in international development would say, well, you know, anything without political will, whether it's ICT or not, will not work.
Competencies of the officials.
Competencies. Okay, so we call it capacity of you know, officials, or capacity, well, just capacities of, you know, the human resources, probably. Right, and I'm just changing these words to just generalize them a little bit more.
Physical infrastructure too.
Physical infrastructure, right? Right, and I want to talk a little bit about this in a little bit, because I always think that, you know, usually the technology, right, and I say, well, the technology is like, okay, this website in itself is overloaded, it doesn't work, it loads very slow. Those things are generally not the major issues, you know, and usually physical infrastructure is not an issue. it usually becomes an issue when you choose a wrong solution, a wrong IT solution, i.e., you're downloading videos in a country where there's no bandwidth, for example. So usually it's not that huge a deal, but let's talk about it. And then what else did he say? He named like seven or eight factors.
Dominance of politics and self-interest.
Sorry?
Dominance of politics.
Politics politics and self-interest. Politics, or what I like to call peanut butter.
Peanut butter?
Yeah, political peanut butter. Most of the time I feel like you're just trying to swim in peanut butter.
I've never heard that.
Well, that's my term. It's a sun term. It's my politically correct way of saying, oh my God, there's so many.
So it's a bureaucracy?
It's the bureaucracy. A lot of times it's also the self-interest. And to give, so the bureaucracy is one level. The self-interest is a lot of times it's like, especially if I'm high up, I'm a minister, my status quo is really comfortable. And so somebody tells me, well, we would like you to open up a feedback website, right? Nobody really wants to do that. They're like, well, what's my advantage? Or downloadable forms? Wait a minute, when people come to me to get forms, I get a bribe of $1 per form. And if I'm going to give it to them free online, this is the sort of conflict you would run into. Okay, what else is there?
Having an appropriate strategy and vision.
Okay, strategy and vision. What are they referring when they talk about this?
Well, in general, I would think it would apply to, say you're putting certain forms online, but those aren't forms that people need a lot of access to, so maybe there's a better project.
Right. Yeah, that could be a lower level type of strategy and vision. A lot of times too, and strategy and vision falls, it runs from the top all the way to the bottom, right? I mean, remember when we talked about like your strategic plan or your methodologies? A lot of times it's, when I started my e-governance work, what you see is just a hodgepodge of projects. Some ministries wanting to do this, and then they start this little website. Another one saying, okay, I want to do forms, and then they start something like that. Another one has an email. And then at some point, there's no strategy. You come up with this like massive sort of shrubs and weeds of all kinds of e-government projects, but then they're not interoperable, for example. You cannot combine systems. And on top of that, there's no ICTD policy, for example, or there are no laws. You could have, for example, these forms that you can say, okay, submit a form, but then the law doesn't follow with saying that, yes, we would accept digital signatures, or we would accept that. So it just becomes messy, and in other words, my famous peanut butter analogy.
So would that just tie into the management of the certain project? If there's a particular person managing it and it is well planned out, then they won't just start to drop it because you assign one project to a manager, they have to see it through.
Right, yeah, and I want to talk about this too, project management, right, which is something else he says is really important. But when we talk about strategy and vision, right, most of the time what you see is in the real world and practice, even in the US, for the longest time, they have these hodgepodge, think about how big government is, right? And then government has all these like little ICTD projects, and then maybe there's a big one, and then, blah, 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 and then, so it's all over the place. So you're talking about, your justice sector is here, your agriculture, whatever. And then there's nothing in place with regards to policies, right? Leadership, and coordination. So what happens is that, a lot of times we come in and then there's just all this mess. Even if each of these projects might be a successful one, from a holistic, if you're running a country and your folks are not able to talk to each other, it doesn't really work from that angle.
Yeah, thinking of the connection between project management and strategy and vision, I can imagine a situation where, say, there's a project to put government agricultural resources, like things you can access on subsidies, fertilizers, or whatever, online. Great. So you have a project manager and he does a great job. It's all integrated. All the resources are clearly identified and labeled on this really great website. but the farmers are illiterate, then the problem was of strategy and targeting, even though the project management might have been impeccable.
Yeah. So, it depends on what level of strategy you're talking about, right? Your project management strategy level might be awesome. For example, you might decide that you want to create your own collaborative project platform. But then if someone else is like, well, I don't really use Google Docs and I do not want to because I really hate Google, right? So there's no way, we'll talk to you, I'll just send my messenger over. So, you still have the same old paper documents being sent over by motorcycle. So you're right. And then somebody needs to come in and say, nope, we are going to be using Google Docs, for example, right? And this is just one example. It's just a technical interoperability, but there's a lot more levels, and we won't go into that in detail. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What else are we missing? This Higgs framework. Let's see. Yeah, I actually think we hit it all, right? Internal politics. There's something he calls change management. Right? And this, a lot of people argue, is within project management anyway. So if you look at this as a framework, and then you just have to know, this was the grandfather, right? And since then, if you look at those indicators, you remember when we talked about what is the indicators of international development, and then you look at, in this day and time, what are the indicators for ICTD, you would see, again, an array of, what are success and failure factors. But Higgs studies, the Higgs studies were right at the very beginning of time when he looked at it and says, oh my gosh, you remember, I think I showed you the slide one time where he evaluated all the e-government projects he could find in 2004 and 2002, and he concluded that, 85% of them were not successful. So he, basically he drilled it down at that point in time to something fairly simple. So if we look at this and say, well, okay, well, if this is one framework that we would buy in, how does this apply to Bangladesh? What are they saying, right? So these are the fairly typical factors, and honestly, if you look at Bruce, our guest speaker, right? He had the hardware, software, what else? Training, support, and infrastructure, right? So if you look at this and you say, well, this is another type of framework, you could probably plug in a lot of things within each other. The frameworks might look different, but at your bottom line is the same. You get what I mean? So if we were to use this, what is happening in the Bangladesh case? What was the factor that, and bear in mind, the study is not what are the factors that are major successes that will lead to successes or failures. The question in that paper was, what do government officials think are the factors, right? So what are they saying? That yes, that's the number one thing, 1, 2, 3 top things in our country.
Are you asking for whether they think it's successful, or the flip side, whether they think those are the big challenges?
The both questions, i.e., they looked at these factors and they said, well, in our country, this is the results that we think are the factors that they rank this based on that website. Yeah, Christina?
We can just start with, so the political will was a success factor.
Is a what?
Was a success factor. There was a lot of political desire and political will.
Right, so basically what they're saying is that this was a success factor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
But there was incompetency of the officials that were.
Right, okay, and then this was a failure factor. So this is an important success, right? And then this is failure in this country, i.e., this website wasn't successful because we did not have competent folks, either the technologists or the governments. Do you know what I'm talking about in particular? Are you all lost? I'm talking about this. Remember? This one summary graph that that summarizes it, right? Where he says, okay, you know, what are the success and failure factors? So what is interesting about the Bangladeshi case is that if you look at what are the factors that they think is most critical, they're saying, well, the internal political desire and the overall vision is the most important. At the end of the day, when we step back, all of these are critical, right? What is happening right now is just that they're saying in Bangladesh, these are the ones that are the top few. Political desire, overall vision, and technological infrastructure. And then the least important is change management, although honestly, when they do the survey, I actually wonder, you know, do people really know what change management is to be able to say, yes, I think this is a factor. Dominance of politics, as I say, you know, how objective can they be? I get the sense that they were doing interviews. You know, so if you're doing interviews, you might not really want to go into that and say, no, there's no problem, right? And competencies doesn't seem, you know, it's a high factor, but not as high as infrastructure and vision. Any feedback on this? You know, particularly in your own experience, if you do. And again, you know, you don't, all these lessons learned, right? Because one of the things in our class is what promotes success and failure in ICTD projects. And this all can be fairly generalized in terms of all kinds of ICTD projects, not just e-governance. So what do you think? I mean, is this fairly reflective? Agree, disagree, if we did this study for governments in, say, the US?
So these were all perceptions though, right?
Yeah.
That, I think, was my main kind of struggle with it. I don't know if their perceptions are accurate enough to make a decision based off of, because they didn't necessarily seem like they had a ton of experience
Right.
with e-government.
Exactly, and that's why initially I was like, you can really question the methodology. When I was trying to assign the readings, I was like, well, you know, what should I be doing? And this is really in response to you saying, well, you know, we want a little bit more case studies. So I thought, okay, well, instead of sort of a generalized and then going down, let's take the down and then go up. You know, and that's what we're doing right now. But yeah, you're right, you know, the methodology in itself is sort of a little flawed. So maybe it can't be generalized. I mean, at the end of the day, all these factors are fairly important. No, not fairly, are critical.
I might take it further and say that the fact that there's a perception that change management isn't critical might mean that's more critical. If they're focusing on technological infrastructure and political desire, well, so you have broadband access now, and you have a politician saying, yeah, we're going to do it.
It should be fairly successful.
I mean, there's a lot of gap there between, you know, saber rattling and having infrastructure and then actually making a project.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and my guess is that, you know, if we took away the methodology and we just look at these indices and we can come up with some kind of a ranking matrix, right? Like, you know, if you design sort of a backend database and you're doing some kind of survey, you have them you have them correlate to each other. I'm guessing that in every localized context, you know, from project onwards, you know, from your teeny tiny projects all the way to a country level, all these factors will come out in different levels of prominence, depending on, I mean, if you really did a real study and a methodology, a sound methodology, the results would likely be all of the above, you know, just depending on the context of the particular situation. So all this to say, you know, when we step back, to essentially look at these and go, okay, number one, this is not just e-governance, because like I said, you can look at each of these frameworks that we've studied, right, across all these factors, agriculture, you know, bottom of pyramid, and all the same old things. Why the projects fail? They all have these same themes. You know, and most of the time, it's not about the technology. You know, at least everybody says that, and that's also my experience. The one thing I want to point out is about the technology infrastructure. A lot of times when, as I mentioned, right, when you talk about the physical infrastructure, you're not really talking about, you know, especially in this day and time, where there's mobile penetration, there's even radio, for example, and radio has been around, you know, in these places as a prominent way of communication. there shouldn't, the infrastructure itself shouldn't be an impediment. But the issue is when you talk about e-governance, the first thing people think about is internet, Obama website, download forms. Oops, people from the villages will not be able to do that. And so, the technological infrastructure becomes sort of a prominent issue, which could be fair in some cases, especially if you're trying to reach rural folks. But most of the time, the technology side of things is not a usual cause of failure. Okay? Question?
Common question kind of. So I was really interested in what the perception was of who should be promoting e-governance.
Yep.
And so I think the most common, or one of the
private companies.
Yeah, so public-private relationships and partnerships. And I was wondering about that. So is that because of infrastructure rollout or not? Because you're saying infrastructure is not, the physical infrastructure is not really the issue.
It's not usually the major issue for why projects fail. Yes, it is an issue, but it's not a prominent issue most times. Yeah. So
my question is, why would they think about PPPs as being the key for infrastructure?
I don't. I was trying to figure that out. I wonder, and there's not enough information here to know what the line of questioning was. But if a lot of the times, I think that there is just a perception, particularly by governments, that don't really know much about ICT or technology, that they would connect technology with private companies. And they say, well, private companies do a better job of promoting that. But if you step back, right, why would a private company have incentive, or why should they promote, say, Obama's website, or, the care, what is that, coveredcare.ca now, the Obamacare, Obamacare policy and the Obamacare website, for example. Why would a private sector do that? And would that not create a conflict of interest situation in sometimes? So I don't know. I get the sense of, if I know Bangladeshi officers, they would probably just kind of. I think that's probably the thing. Like, I don't know. What do you mean by promotion of website? I don't know what that is. It's a private sector thing.
So my least cynical side would say that maybe there could be a good.
But you're too young to be cynical. You're the young generation. You're my hope,
I believe that, especially in a government situation, there could be a chance of political manipulation in the provision of information. Like in elections, if the government in power is saying, "Oh yes, we're going to through e-governance improve election information," they would then also have the power to skew that information towards their own side. So there could be a really pure motivation of private sector wouldn't have the skewing motivations. On a more practical side, we learned a little bit about theories of change in organizations and how to make organizations change their behaviors. And the big thing we talked about is there's always resistance to adaptive management in any kind of change. So if a person currently doesn't see e-governance or websites or any kind of technology as part of their job, there's a real fear. Like, I'm good at my job right now. If you add something new to my job that I'm not good at, I could be out of a job. So it's extremely common for there to be organizational resistance to adding anything to the scope of their job. So it could just be a defense mechanism. Keep it away from me.
But isn't that contradictory with the high political will that they found? Yeah, so it comes down to the methodology. I think you're right. If they just ask them, well, do you want e-governance? Of course they're going to say yes.
Yeah.
If you ask them how you're going to provide it, well, PPP.
Yeah, it's like, and why not NGOs? The NGO was part of part of the answers, but it's not as high as private sector, right? If we're talking about the elections, NGOs would probably be or the UN or the election committee, global election committee would be better than say T-Mobile, doing your elections. So yeah, I guess the takeaway would be really just to get a sense of everything that we have done so far, right? there are these themes that come up. Like I said, you can plunk in bruises, you can plunk in your bottom of the pyramid that we have studied, you can plunk in, the e-health, what fails, and it'll come back to these same old factors. And in the early days, one of the major reasons why ICT projects failed so easily was because everyone went in from the technical angle, So it's like, okay, here's a project, use it. It's like one laptop per child. I'm hoping to be able actually to use a couple of the one laptop per child as case studies next quarter after the break when we study project management. But I'm actually kind of disappointed because they're folded. There were 3 case studies that talked about all their struggles, but then they have since folded, which sort of this means there's an ending to a story, which isn't as fun when we're doing cases with it. Okay, well, on that note, hey, maybe our presenters are on spring break too, so that all works out. It's good. At my age, I always believe, somehow things happen or not for a reason. So, any questions on this? Any questions on e-governance? And I thought, well, worst case scenario, if they don't come here, I will extract one of my old e-governance PowerPoints that I used to give at lectures and at seminars and conferences, and actually talk about them. But any questions, observations, feedback on anything that we've done so far, even aside from e-governance, observations? Krista?
I find it a little interesting. I don't disagree with the technological infrastructure usually isn't the problem anymore, but it was interesting to talk about that right after the Nano presentation where he talked a lot about technological infrastructure, about choosing the wrong hardware, about choosing the wrong software,
right?
About choosing the wrong operating system.
Yeah, and that's right? And if you think about it, but it's true because the Invenio folks, right, the software and OS, the Invenio folks are doing, that's their niche. So they actually go in and they try to I guess figure these things out. Which is, but still, at the end of the day, I was having lunch with Bruce. I was like, most of the time the technology really isn't the issue. And the reason why people would actually even choose a wrong software to begin with, is usually because they did not do a proper needs assessment, right? It's not like well, the hardware itself does not work, or not anymore. But it's you're choosing a piece of like Dell computer for a country that had no support for Dell, for example.
So would we say that's then a project management problem?
Well, and that's how I'm trying to say, well, how can I tell everyone what we're going to study, right? Because project management is it could be broad, it could be narrow, right? This is what we talk about. On what levels do we study? And that's actually my challenge. It comes back to sort of the feedback that you have for this class, which is, oh my gosh, we're squishing in, everything, including the kitchen sink. How do we make sense of things so that we actually go deep enough? The way that I look at it, I think the project management, if I look at Heath's framework and I say, okay, I'm going to come up with a SAN framework, right? If I'm an academic and I would be like, okay, I want to argue things for argument's sake. And I come from a project management background, so obviously project management will be the centerpiece of everything. I would say, most of this is really about project management, right? This whole piece is about project management. I would go in and say, well, if there's no political will to begin with during my needs assessment, and needs assessment is part of the project management component, then forget about the project. You get what I mean? So I don't know yet, because I'm like, well, how much of all these do I want to do? And I guess it's really about touch and go. But you're right. I mean, if I were to go in and try to see if a particular project is feasible, then all these things will be taken into consideration as a part of project management, because your human resources would be part of your project management. But that's a good question. I don't know yet. Maybe stay tuned, because I've been thinking about that. Yeah. Any other feedback, comments? Okay, well.